A police interview room in 2017. Stephen Hoff is cross-examined about a crime committed 44 years earlier.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
This man is violent through and through. It's part of his internal makeup.
But is he a killer? Hours before the body of Janet Cummings was found, the teenage Stephen Hoff had been hiding in nearby undergrowth.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
Hoff would walk free from suspicion as another man was convicted.
We all know there have been miscarriages of justice in the past.
Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
Stephen Hoff went unpunished for 44 years, but then a knock on the door of Janet's mother signalled the reopening of the case.
In May 2016, we went to Irene Cummings' home address in Flint to inform her that North Wales Police were reinvestigating the circumstances of Janet's death in 1976.
This was a mystery like few others. Investigators needed to know. Was it Stephen Hoff who was responsible for the death of Janet Cummings? Why was Stephen Hoff a young man made for murder? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
The violence within this man is extraordinary, and murder was always going to be part of his life story.
Stephen Hoff, even at school, someone to avoid.
Stephen Hoff attended Flint High School, described by many as being a big, powerful lad, also a bully, was quite intimidating to other pupils.
For him, the bullying was just an inherent part of his way of conducting himself.
Big for his age.
He played sort of rugby for Flint Rugby Club as well, and played again for the senior club, even though he was only 16, 17 years of age, because he was a big, powerful, stocky man.
Dr. Donna Young's a forensic psychologist, trained to reveal the red flags in the timelines of killers, struck by Hoff's willingness to put his weight about.
For anybody who knows the signs, there would have been something very animalistic about the way he conducted himself physically.
1976 Flint in North Wales. Population 5,000. A quiet, unassuming town nestled on the River Dee, just 20 miles south of Liverpool in England. A tight-knit community where people knew each other's business.
Flint town was generally a safe place to live. Flint had links to steel manufacturing and so forth. There was a high employment rate as a result of that. And generally, people in Flint felt safe.
It's quite a small community, so pretty much everybody would know everybody one way or the other in a town of that size.
Locals, familiar with each other, a safe place. But that changed one cold winter's afternoon. The Cummins family lived in a bungalow in King Edward's Drive near the town centre. Eileen and Ted had only one child, Janet.
She was a fairly quiet girl. She had a small number of friends, played in the street where she lived. At the end of the previous year, 1975, a new leisure centre had opened in Flint town, not too far from where Janet lived, and Janet and her circle of friends loved going down there to the swimming pool, and that was part of their interests.
On the evening of the 7th of January, 1976, 15-year-old Janet Cummings and her mum had a bit of an argument. Janet wanted to go swimming, but her mum thought she looked unwell, so she told Janet she couldn't go. Janet was not to be deterred.
When mum went to check on her about 7:30, She'd seen that Janet had actually left the house, left a note to say she'd gone to the swimming pool, but she would be back at 8:30 p.m, so Mum and Dad weren't too concerned.
A number of friends saw Janet that evening. One saw her at about 7:35 at the swimming baths. Another friend saw Janet at 8:15 in a road near to her house. And a bit later on, Janet went to a friend's house and asked if that friend could come out, but she wasn't allowed. That was the last sighting of Janet alive.
By 12 o'clock, 12 p.m, you can imagine that her parents were very worried indeed, and in fact frantic, so decided to walk down to the police station in Flint and reported her as a missing person. When you consider that Janet had never been missing before, when you consider that she was only 15 years of age, it was a dark, cold winter's night, then the risk associated with that missing person report would undoubtedly be high risk, and the policing response to a high risk missing person is very significant indeed.
Janet was discovered lying under a hedge on the edge of the local primary school field. Her body had been dragged along the ground. She was still clothed, but both shoes were missing.
She was found in the bushes, essentially lying slightly on one side, but on her back. Her body had been semi-concealed, and she'd clearly been murdered.
A post-mortem was carried out, and it was revealed that she had been violently sexually assaulted.
She was the victim of quite a violent sexual assault, which involved both vaginal and anal penetration. I think it's probably occurred at or around the time of her death or slightly afterwards.
The seemingly random nature of the attack would make this a tough investigation, not helped by the limitations of the day.
This is 1976, so there's virtually no CCTV, mobile phones haven't been invented, and forensic science is nothing like what it is today.
The young man responsible for Janet's death was Stephen Huff. He had carried out an appalling sexual assault prior to her death.
I'm firmly of the view that she walked past the back entrance of Stephen Huff's home address, and there he was laying in wait and attacked her at that location. He raped Janet and then smothered her until she actually died.
Understanding Stephen Huff means understanding his nature and motivation, both of which add up to him being lethally dangerous.
The murder itself is not actually the point of the activity. The point of the activity is the rape. The murder is collateral damage. It's an incidental side effect of the brutal way in which he carries out his rapes.
Huff is a sadistic rapist. He gets his kicks from seeing a woman completely overpowered in absolute distress and pain. He's not having sex with her for her privilege and enjoyment. He's doing it to harm her because he has selfish needs.
That attack was a huge warning sign that this was a man made for murder.
Huff had been in the year above Janet at high school, but he was never seriously considered a suspect.
On the day that Janet went missing, Stephen Huff was a 16-year-old boy, 5 days short of his 17th birthday. He lived with his parents very close to where the body of Janet was found, and also no more than about 400 yards from Janet Cummins' home address.
120 police began making door-to-door inquiries. All local men aged 17 to 22 were asked to account for their movements on the night of Janet's murder. Huff was one of them.
He was particularly nervous and couldn't really answer their questions. So the police that were conducting those house inquiries reported that matter to the detectives that were investigating that murder, because they felt that more questions needed to be asked of Stephen Huff.
The questioning removed him from the suspects list.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
He denied any knowledge of Janet's killing, but he did admit to being out that evening.
Huff openly told investigators that he had been masturbating in a car at the time of the murder before going on to commit another offence. And that's why he was nervous being interviewed.
He had the best sort of alibi. Not only did I not do this, but I was doing something else. And not the alibi of I don't know where I was. It was I know where I was and I was doing something very specific.
This is a man who will talk about his masturbation openly. This is a man who will try and use the fact that he's stealing as an alibi. He's utterly antisocial in his personality, as well as being psychopathic in his cognitive style.
It would be 40 years before the truth of what he had done that night would be wholly and forensically investigated.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephen Huff had figured out a way to avoid being charged in connection with the rape and death of Janet Cummings. He told officers he was breaking into a car at the time Janet had been murdered.
What he had done was taken the scent from him entirely. The police said, we're now happy with him because he's given us an account. He was clearly nervous because he'd been out committing crime.
He was later charged with that crime, went to magistrates' court and was fined.
The full details of Janet's death were not immediately released to the public. It had been a brutal attack. Police wanted a quick arrest. With Stephen Huff in the clear, another young man, Noel Jones, would soon come under the spotlight. Perfect for Stephen Huff.
This man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy.
His plan to get away with Janet's death was helped by what 1970s investigative methods were available to police, and the police's eagerness to charge someone.
Back then in 1976, there was no DNA technology. What could you do with swabs? Well, you can actually analyse those swabs to see if you get a blood grouping from what was identified to be semen, and that came back with a blood group O.
Armed with limited forensic evidence, the detectives turned their attention to who had the opportunity to pounce on Janet.
The police took an interest in members of the travelling fraternity that had set up an illegal encampment about 3 miles away from Flint in a small village called Northup.
An 18-year-old traveller called Noel Jones was arrested for Janet's murder. He was interviewed, but he was barely literate.
His was blood group O, as found at the scene.
Janet Cummings had a vaginal tear and she had an anal tear. Semen was found in the vagina. Now, in those days, when that was analysed, it was the same blood group type as Noel Jones, but then so are thousands and thousands of people in the country.
Unwittingly keeping Huff in the clear, Noel Jones's girlfriend told police that he had confessed to killing Janet. It was not true. He'd said it as part of a row with his girlfriend. Noel Jones suddenly found himself under immense pressure. At first, when questioned, he denied the offence.
Noel Jones went to court in the summer of 1976 and pleaded not guilty. He told his lawyer he wasn't responsible. He told his probation worker that he wasn't responsible and was denying everything to his family as well and saying, I haven't done this.
During this time, Huff remained beyond suspicion. Detectives felt they had their man. The horror of what Janet had suffered and a quirk of the law was about to help those pressing for the prosecution of Noel Jones.
When the judge heard the evidence of the pathologist in this case, where the pathologist said she wasn't actually strangled, there were actually very few injuries to the body of Janet. And what they felt is that whilst she was being raped, she was being smothered as well. The heart stopped as a result of the shock of what was happening. So when the judge heard that, he wasn't convinced that the prosecution could prosecute for murder and offered the alternative charge of manslaughter. Noel Jones, if he'd been convicted of murder, would probably have served in the region of 20 to 25 years in prison. He was told that if he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, he'd probably get about 12 years, but he'd only serve half that sentence.
Having suffered at the hands of other prisoners when on remand, Noel decided that he couldn't cope with a lifelong sentence. He could cope with 6 years.
He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings, and therefore there's a very strong presumption that anybody who's pleaded guilty to an offence is guilty of that offence.
Guilty of manslaughter, rape and buggery. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
It really does beg a belief that it could be, as it was then, that he was spoken to, and within a very, very short time, he'd made an elaborate, complete confession.
Who's a young man who's very vulnerable, has learning difficulties, and essentially is to some degree coerced into admitting that he was guilty of the crime.
Stephen Lloyd would come to know the Cummins family well as the police family liaison officer. Members of Janet's family were not convinced by the verdict back then. Lloyd spoke to one, Janet's uncle, Derek.
When Noel Jones was taken out in the police car on the second night, I think, and they drove round Flint, where he's pointing out where he saw Janet first of all, and where he followed her over the fields of Flint High School, you know, almost past Janet's home address, and to the Gorset Stones where they've attacked her. Derek certainly didn't believe that aspect of it, and I never did from 1976, so Derek had his doubts.
Doubts or not, Huff was now decidedly in the clear, and the reduction in the charge from murder to manslaughter would have repercussions 4 decades later, directly affecting the chances of ever charging Stephen Huff with murder. Huff was free to get on with his life, whilst Noel began his sentence.
This man will do whatever it takes to achieve the ends he desires, and he has the presence of mind, the systematic, strategic style of thinking that enables him to follow that through. So this man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy. So for him, it was a useful situation when another man was convicted for his first crime.
He obviously thought that his troubles were over when Noah Jones was so publicly tried and so publicly pleaded guilty and served a sentence for it. And there was never any demur from Noah Jones about his guilt. There was never any appeal process, and it was a guilty plea from him, not a finding by a jury. Had it been a finding by a jury, that might have been less comforting.
Stephen Huff goes about his business literally having got away, scot-free, with killing Janet Cummins.
When you are a criminal with sadistic tendencies and you get away with your crime, it bolsters your sense of self. You feel that you are brighter than the police, you can outsmart authorities, and it means that those predilections and desires that you have within your nature, they have a new belief system, which is that you are above the law.
Feeling above the law, Stephen Huff was very much a danger to women.
Stephen Huff is not a one-off adolescent explosive incident kind of attacker.
He was made to attack again. By 1980, Huff decided to leave Flint and start a new life abroad, in the army.
The thing about being in the army is it gives you an opportunity to travel. And what we know about people who join the army who have this nature is they have many, many opportunities to harm vulnerable people along the way. And it's very hard, because of where they are and the travelling, to identify them.
Having so cynically avoided arrest and seen an innocent man convicted, what Huff did next is puzzling.
At the age of 21, whilst he was stationed in Germany, he got married, and he admitted to his wife that he'd killed someone back home. His wife asked him if it was Janet Cummings, but he wouldn't say.
It's hard to know why Huff would have decided to confide in his wife. We could imagine on a human level that he feels some level of guilt, but it could also be power play, a way of letting her know his capabilities and testing her.
It has never been revealed if his then wife believed him, or if she felt too frightened to report the conversation. Huff was still able to plan attacks on women.
Being in the army, you are very, very trusted. It's very rare for any human being to see a person in position of power, a position of protection, to believe that they could be sinister. So it automatically creates leverage. People will feel safe around you, and that gives you an incredible access.
If his uniform camouflaged the intent of a sex attacker, he soon used it.
The receptionist incident is where it all came together for me.
He carried out an attack at a hotel. Stephen Huff had been out drinking for most of the day. This female walked into the toilets, closely followed by Stephen Huff. He attacked that female and he strangled her to the point that she passed out. And they were disturbed, or so he was disturbed, and ran away. But witnesses were able to say that he was clearly British because he still had his uniform on. Inquiries led them to Stephen Huff. Stephen Huff was charged with grievous bodily harm.
Huff was thrown out of the army for the attack and in 1988 was sentenced to 5 years in a military prison.
It's violence against a stranger. It's not violence that's triggered by any kind of emotional build-up, which is what we ordinarily see. It's violence that is out of all proportion. It's extreme violence that is readily triggered. And then there's the abductive quality to the violence, where Huff wants to get his victim away in private so he can relish the act of carrying out the attack on her, is a frightening indicator of somebody for whom violence is a purely focused pleasure.
By the 90s, living back in his hometown of Flint, Stephen Huff was now in his second marriage and had 2 children.
He was a long-distance lorry driver, doing most of his journeys abroad. And that was something which perplexed all of us, that had he had the opportunity, as he clearly did, to make a new life in a different country, he could have done. But he returned to his home, he stayed in the same place in Flint, lived there in the same street he'd grown up in, and was there for everybody to see.
How would justice ever catch up with Stephen Huff?
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that. It seemed a bit bizarre, really.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephen Huff lived under the radar throughout the 90s and into the new century.
This is a predator who will be walking among us freely.
But justice began to move in on him because of retained evidence found on Janet's body 4 decades earlier. Police had always known that swabs taken at the time indicated there was a potential second attacker. Advances in DNA tracing meant that North Wales Police could hold a case review.
In 2006, an officer who was working on that investigation decided there may be merits in having a look at what was uncovered forensically from that, to see actually was there a potential second person involved in that killing.
A new DNA imprint was found, but could not be matched with anyone on the national database. So little help to Noel Jones, who was by now living a new life.
Detectives were no doubt disappointed when the national DNA database did not throw up a match for the samples retrieved from Janet's body.
The lack of a match, however, did not detract from the facts, which were now clear. Evidence suggested Janet had indeed suffered at the hands of an attacker other than Noel Jones. Perhaps Noel Jones was an innocent man.
I became concerned about the original conviction, and felt that there was this very strong possibility that this was a miscarriage of justice.
With no more leads, the case was cold. Huff was still in the clear. It was now a waiting game. Police had DNA from an unknown man found on Janet's body in Flint in 1976, and no more.
We decided to upload it onto the national database to see if, at any time in the future, that would actually hit against a person that may be of interest to that inquiry.
To avoid detection, all Huff had to do was to commit no further crimes. But in 2016, literally on his home turf, Stephen Huff was unable to resist temptation.
Stephen Huff is arrested in connection with allegations of a similar nature to those surrounding Janet's disappearance and death.
He allowed a child to have a party at his home, and during the course of that party, people drank rather more than they should have done, and he became embroiled in physical contact with one of those there, which left his mark in the form of DNA.
His DNA was taken and it was loaded onto the database, and it gave a direct hit between that swab result from the trousers of Janet Cummins and the DNA of Stephen Huff.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database.
Stephen Huff's continual offending did put him at risk of eventually being arrested, certainly. But we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful the violent drive is within him, or how arrogant his thinking would have been about the likelihood of detection.
It just shows you that even killers who believe they've got away with it are more and more recognising that it's only a matter of time before they're caught.
As Janet's family and Huff were both living in Flint, this was a delicate operation.
My involvement with the family, I can only describe them as absolutely fantastic, hard-working family who supported North Wales Police all the way through the 2016 investigation.
40 years on, the community of Flint was thrust into the spotlight again as Janet's traumatic killing hit the headlines.
I think there was a little bit of disbelief in the town of Flint, really, that a local man could have done such a thing, where they believed for so long that a traveller was responsible, which I guess fitted into their mindset, really, of it not being a local person.
After 4 decades, police have 57-year-old Stephen Huff in custody and can start the detailed re-examination of the case. They were determined to make no mistakes.
The most important thing in any investigation is the continuity and integrity of evidence that's seized, exhibits, whether they be clothing, forensic exhibits, making sure that whoever handles that evidence is signing the exhibit labels, the continuity statements, and their subsequent integrity of the way the material is stored and preserved. It cannot be challenged.
He was taken to North Wales, where he was interviewed over a period of several days. He initially started to speak to the police. He was initially quite confident, because naturally we wouldn't disclose the strength of our forensic evidence from the off.
First of all, we'd like to talk to you about the murder of Janet Cummins in 1976. What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummins in January 1976?
No comment.
He came across initially as quite a cocky person who would talk about anything and everything at that particular time.
He denied any involvement in Janet's killing, despite the fact that they presented him with the very compelling DNA evidence.
So she's been vaginally raped, anally raped, and during the course of that, she's also suffered suffocation around the face and neck. And certainly those injuries that I've specified to you indicate that. Okay? Now, taking into account all those injuries and the cause of death, Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database. That swab is a full hit on the semen cell stain from Janet Cummins' trousers in 1976. Now, if you fully understand what I'm saying, if you want me to explain it, I'll explain it to you.
Huff's DNA match proved that he was 1 billion times more likely to be Janet's killer than anybody else.
And that's when Stephen Huff, probably on the advice of his solicitor, We don't know. But then he didn't talk to us anymore.
So, Stephen, please explain how your semen is on Janet Cummings' discharge. Is there any explanation you can give me at this time? Are you willing to give an explanation?
Hoff displayed no emotion, no remorse. No surprise to Donna Youngs.
The dragging of the victim into the bushes and then attacking her while she's face down is very consistent with an animal attacking another animal in the wild. The humanity of the prey is utterly irrelevant.
The biggest obstacle that police and prosecutors faced was that, officially, this crime already had been successfully prosecuted. Patrick Harrington QC was charged with defending Hoff.
The obvious and curious aspect to the preparation of this case was that at the time of the murder, a suspect had not only been arrested, but made what was on the face of it a complete and accurate confession as to what he said he had done. And when he got to court, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings.
We were now prosecuting someone 40 years later of a crime where someone stood convicted of that offence.
If someone else had been responsible for the death of Janet Cummings, how could Hoff be guilty? Did he stand a realistic chance of avoiding conviction?
It was a unique case because Noel Jones stood convicted of that killing. So we knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephen Heff to say, actually, this is what happened to me back then. This is why I signed a false confession, and this is me now.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
When under interrogation by police, Stephen Hoff showed no signs of confessing.
Stephen, are you responsible?
No comment.
Building their case against Hoff meant focusing on the scientific strides made in forensic investigation over 40 years and ensuring the facts from the night of the attack could be established. Pathologist Dr. Brian Rogers was asked to re-examine the original pathology report.
I first got involved with this case, which was a cold case back in 2016, when North Wales Police contacted me to see if I would be able to have a re-look at the forensic evidence.
It was not going to be straightforward.
The post-mortem was limited, and the photographs were quite limited of the post-mortem. They were also rather poor quality. They were only black and white. You couldn't see things clearly.
Step by step, the crime was revisited. From the head wound that Janet suffered, it seemed clear that her attacker was prepared to use catastrophic violence.
It looked like a blunt force impact. I mean, in theory, it could have been caused if her head's been pushed down onto a rock or a stone or something like that, or she could have been hit with something. If someone was struck with a bottle, it would produce a laceration of that type.
Using his stature violently was a Hoff trademark. Rogers confirmed that Janet had been held face down with her neck compressed by someone's hands.
The whole picture of her death pointed to one of external airway occlusion, which is essentially this, for whatever mechanism, hand or face down, and neck compression. I mean, essentially, she was suffocated during this attack.
Then there were the new findings.
The vaginal and anal swabs were still on record, and a DNA match was subsequently made.
DNA has come on in leaps and bounds, even in the last couple of decades. Time was when you'd have to explain to a jury how the calculations are made about probabilities. Nowadays, juries are sufficiently familiar with DNA because it's on their radar, that once you tell them the DNA was there, they are perfectly prepared to accept that as being definitive.
The case against Hoff was mounting. There were his other offences to be considered too.
His offending history had continued for 40 years, and his pattern of offending had continued, and clearly sexual offending was very prevalent within his offending history and offending cycle as well.
2016 and Stephen Huff is finally facing a day in court related to the rape and death of Janet Cummings. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Huff refused to admit his guilt.
He went to trial, denying the case, said he wasn't responsible.
He was remarkably relaxed. I wouldn't say calm, but he was certainly relaxed.
Huff's defence argued that there could have been a mishandling of the investigation in 1976.
We actually called as a witness for the defence the barrister who'd represented Noah Jones as the junior barrister at his case in 1976. And he was resolute in the evidence that he gave that there had been nothing about the confession made in the police interviews, supported by his confession by a guilty plea, that caused the barrister any concern at all.
Noel Jones, now married with children, was still at the centre of the case and had served 6 years for Janet's death. If Harrington could establish that Noel was guilty, how could Huff be guilty?
If we could establish, just on the basis that brought a query to the mind of the jury, that he may have been the killer, and having pleaded guilty there was a strong presumption he was, if we could establish that, then by a process of elimination it could not have been Stephen Huff.
We knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephen Huff, to say actually it wasn't me. Basically the pressure I was put in by the police back then made me sign and say things that weren't true, and he gave really compelling evidence.
By denying his guilt, Huff himself was content to leave a stain over the character of the innocent Noel Jones.
There are two parts of Stephen Huff's personality which meant he could sit back and watch an innocent man serve years in prison. The first is that he is a psychopath. He has no empathy. He has a purely strategic focus to his thinking. The second is he has an antisocial personality.
It was time for a jury to decide if Stephen Huff was a man made to kill.
The jury were asked to retire, having heard the evidence. But significantly in this case, and I think it's the only time it's happened in legal history, is that the judge gave two directions to the jury before they could convict Stephen Huff. They had to be sure, beyond reasonable doubt, that Noel Jones was not connected whatsoever to that murder before they could move on to the evidence against Stephen Huff, and to be sure again, beyond reasonable doubt, that he was in fact responsible for the killing. So there were two hurdles, if you like, for us to get over in that court case, but we got over them.
Huff was convicted of manslaughter, rape and buggery. For manslaughter, he got 12 years. For rape, he got 8 years, and for buggery, he got 8 years. But all those sentences were to run concurrently. In other words, at the same time. So the total sentence was just 12 years.
The people of Flint, still around from 1976, and Janet's family, finally had justice. To some, only of a sort.
What must be heartbreaking in this crime is that Janet Cummings' family never lost sight of their desire to bring the person who killed their child and their relative to justice. And what justice is there in a 12-year sentence for stealing a whole life?
I think the family are certainly a different family to what they were in 2016 when the investigation was taking place, in a better place. And I think they probably a bit more, relaxed and, content that the right person has been convicted of Janet's murder and that an innocent man has now been exonerated.
Huff was sentenced to 3 offences for sexually assaulting the 15-year-old girl in 2016. Because Noel Jones had been sent to prison for manslaughter, not murder, Huff, a minor at the time of the offence, benefited from the lesser charge.
He was naturally very relieved that he was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, with the consequences that brings, and I think he was simply looking forward, counting the days, to when his eventual release will come. Had he been convicted of murder, that would effectively mean that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, because he would have got a significant tariff for this offence, 15 years as an absolute minimum, probably rather longer than that.
In the judge's sentencing comments He pointed out that Huff had been booted out of the army after being found guilty of assaulting yet another person. Clearly, that assault may never have happened if Huff had been arrested way back when in connection with Janet's killing.
In 1976, confused and vulnerable, Noel Jones had admitted to a crime that he did not commit.
It was only in 1982 when he was released that he was able to rebuild his life. He changed his name so that he'd be anonymised, went on to marry, had some children, and it was only his family that he ever told about what happened to him.
Jones had never challenged his conviction, but after Stephen Huff was put behind bars and then aged 61, Noel decided to clear his name.
There was very little publicity about Noah Jones's acquittal in the Court of Appeal. Sir Brian Levison heard the appeal, apparently with great sensitivity, and the appeal was allowed, as I say, without any resistance from the prosecution. And he is now unconvicted, acquitted of the crime to which he pleaded guilty 40 years ago.
Police finally got the man responsible for the death of Janet Cummins. The grim story of the crimes of Stephen Huff have spanned 4 decades.
I've prosecuted or defended in more than 250 homicide cases, but there are certainly some that stand out in your recollection, and this will be one. I'll never forget Stephen Huff.
Stephen Huff retains control of one thing, a precise confession as to what happened that night, leaving the family still wondering.
They deserve to know where Janet was killed. They deserve to know what the full circumstances of her death were. Because they weren't there, were they? And the only person that was there who knows is Stephen Anthony Huff, who so far hasn't told anybody what the circumstances are.
Karen Pedley was on duty at a West Cornwall nursing home the night it was gutted by fire.
Oh yeah, they were all in there acting the fool and laughing and dancing, and Karen was putting them to bed.
It was the curtains in that room that had been set alight, and the room itself was absolutely devastated. Both ladies in that room were hospitalised.
Fire kills, and fire kills horribly. In some respects, you're lucky if you die of smoke inhalation first.
One woman did die. How had the fire begun? This wasn't the first time that one of Karen Pedley's places of work had been struck by a suspicious blaze.
Fire seems to follow this girl around, and you'd really need to start thinking how and where and what else has happened in the past that we don't know about.
It would take years for investigators to link a string of arson attacks. And when they did, they would discover that Karen Pedley was once a hero, raising an alarm at her family home.
It was through responding to the fire that Karen got a taste of approval and of even existing, of having any identity of her own.
Hailed as a lifesaver, did that incident in Karen's childhood mean she was made for murder? What made Karen the schoolgirl, Karen the killer? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. It was at the age of 10 when Karen became the local hero. She saved her family from a house fire.
Karen discovered a fire that had begun in the airing cupboard at her family home. She alerted her parents. Everyone was safely evacuated from the house.
She was praised and lauded in the local press for saving her family from a blaze that eventually gutted their house. She was awarded a trip on Concorde, featured in the local newspaper, and for a little while was really quite something.
Little Karen had saved the lives of her 6 brothers and sisters. Now infirm, one remembers how close she had been to losing her life.
Flames were coming out and I had to jump the flames to get out of the house. I was the last one out and we lost everything, absolutely everything in that house fire.
It was a big moment in the life of a little girl, one who may have felt that no one had taken very much notice of. Criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith and forensic psychologist Dr. Donna Youngs have been tracing the life and the crime of Karen Pedley. 6 siblings, struggling for attention in normal circumstances, but in this family, my sense is that she was barely identified as a separate human being.
It would have all been, very chaotic probably, and unless you've got quite dedicated, caring and skilled parents, children get very lost in that kind of atmosphere.
To any child, the amount of attention that Karen Pedley got for saving the day when this fire broke out in the family home would impact upon them. But to someone whose childhood, whose upbringing to this point was so psychologically barren, the impact on her and on who she became would have been absolutely enormous.
Some family members deny that Karen was not shown enough attention when a child, but they all agree that she was feted in the paper, praised in the local community, rewarded with a trip on Concorde. This was an extraordinary moment in Karen's otherwise ordinary existence, but it couldn't last.
The thing with these kinds of stories is they have a shelf life. They would only last maybe a couple of weeks at best, and Karen Pedley would have very, very quickly been thrown unceremoniously back into that life where she was probably, or felt like she was nobody.
The impact of the episode was far longer lasting. Forensic psychologist Dr. Donna Youngs believes fire acquired a very special place in the heart of Karen Pedley.
Karen Pedley, within a family background where I think there's probably a real deficit of communication and a meaningful emotional communication, fire becomes her way of communicating with the outside world. It's her way of getting attention, it's her way of making a point, it's her way of striking out in revenge. It's her way of having an identity.
Shortly after their home was gutted by fire, the family relocated from Bedfordshire to Cornwall in England. Karen Stringer grew up and married, becoming Mrs. Karen Pedley.
She had children, and she found a number of casual work in the local Cornwall area.
In a large extended family, nephew Junior remembers Karen as his fun auntie.
She was a really caring auntie. She would take us out on a moped. Yeah, she was a bit reckless, but it was like she was safe at doing it. Like, she wouldn't put us in any danger. And if she knew something was going to happen, she'd make it stop before it did happen. Out of all the aunts and uncles that I had, my Auntie Karen was my favourite because she was there for us. She was really supportive.
But while Karen came across as happy and carefree, her life was far from rosy.
Karen Pedley did not have an easy life. She clearly struggled with many elements of life. She had a menial job, she couldn't even hold that down.
She seemed to have an uneven career, often getting fired from some pubs and places such as that.
In 2002, Karen Pedley got a job as a cleaner at the Trafula House nursing home in St. Day. Shortly after she started, a fire broke out. No one was hurt, and no one could work out how it had started. No arrests were made after a short investigation. In 2006, Karen and her family moved to the village of Carharrick. Curiously, the mysterious fires seemed to follow her.
She worked at a shop, a care home, and a working men's club. And at some stage, all of those premises were set alight. It seemed if Karen got cross, fire would follow soon after.
On a number of occasions with these fires, they seem to relate to places where she'd left in some degree of acrimony, whether that's been fired or whatever. She was very often the person who called the fire brigade, and she was very often the first person on scene.
Karen lost her job at one care home when the manager found her asleep under a table during a night shift. A few days later, the home suffered an arson attack.
Some patterns started to build in Karen Pedley's life, and fire actually formed a big part of those patterns. In a lot of the jobs that she had, there would be fires afterwards, and especially it seems when maybe she'd left on bad terms. And it started to build a picture. Certainly for us looking back, we can see a picture of fire after fire after fire. But she seemed to be getting away with it at the time, and nobody was joining the dots.
It seemed that Karen Pedley had found a way of feeling in control in a life that was often chaotic.
I can see that somebody who must have felt so powerless, it's not surprising that somebody like that would be instinctively drawn to something as potent and something that has such a life of its own as fire.
Criminologist Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith believes playing this role was all part of the thrill for Karen Pedley.
This is a mania, this is a compulsion, this is something that is taking over her thoughts way too much of the time. And very, very often those people will want to be there once the fire is set. That is the glory moment for them. It's such a huge drama, and all because of them. They created it.
Nobody had been hurt so far because of the fires that Pedley had begun. She was not under suspicion, so she could get work in places where a fire might easily cause death, where people were vulnerable.
In 2008, she got a job at a care home in Cornwall, where, of course, elderly and vulnerable people lived. She was described as unassuming, somebody who just went about their work quietly.
The manager of the Rosewin House care home is Jenny Spargo.
We were just like one big family. They were my family then. We also had flats which were for the people who were much more able, but they used to come into our place for lunch, and they'd come in for tea and come in and join with the activities, and then if they became poorly they could then move into the home, and it was just like basically one big happy family.
Rosewin House felt safe to those who lived and worked there. Good enough for Jenny to put her own mum there.
My mother was there for 4.5 years. I also lived there, which meant I was there 24/7. So they obviously were more family to me than anything else, really. So it was just the way I lived. It wasn't a job anymore. It was just my life.
Rosewin for Jenny was a labour of love, but in the nursing home sector, recruitment is a well-known problem.
It's not easy to employ staff, and it's not always easy to employ like 20-old ladies as well, women or children, you know. It can be quite difficult sometimes.
It was in 2008 that Rosewin House and Alverton Terrace in Truro got the call from Karen Pedley, looking for work. She had good references. There was no indication that she wouldn't be a useful addition to the team.
She came originally, I think, to be a cook or a cleaner, or she was going to be domestic side, but she did a bit of cooking, she did a bit of cleaning, but she could also do care as well. At the time, she seemed to fit in with everybody, and I didn't have any complaints from anybody, so no reason to think there was any problems, really.
She wasn't on a barred list. She didn't have convictions which meant that she would be recognised as someone who shouldn't be working with vulnerable people.
There were no red flags on Karen Pedley's employment record. Her troubling backstory was yet to be uncovered. The little girl who had grown to be the woman who played with fire was all set to be a threat and was not concerned who might get burnt.
on the day of the fire, I got up like normal, went to school, and the bell rang for school to finish, and it just felt normal, like we were waiting for our mum, and then we just got kept in the office, and then I think it was like an hour later my mum turned up and said that the house had been on fire.
In 2008, despite her checkered employment history, Karen Pedley was working at Roseman Residential Nursing Home in Truro. Before long, she was taking responsibility for the lives and well-being of the elderly residents.
As far as we know, had all the normal duties of a care assistant. And they're actually quite difficult, quite physical sometimes. So that would be maybe dealing with continence issues of patients, maybe turning them, making sure that they don't get sores, helping them to eat.
Nobody ever sort of came to me with complaints, but sometimes I didn't really see very much of her. She didn't work full-time all the time, so it was sort of a bit hit and miss, I suppose, with her, really.
There were no complaints about Karen, but she had a few concerns of her own. For one thing, she told how she was convinced that the nursing home was a fire risk.
During that time there, she had mentioned to her sister that she was really, really concerned about the state of some of the electrics in the residents' rooms. Seemed to be suggesting that they were a fire risk.
She kept whinging about it. She was saying about the electrics at the place. They could see the wire, you could see on the plug sockets were hanging out. The socket was off the wall, and you could see all the leads there. And there was electric fire in one of the rooms. And you could see the wires in that. She said it was wrong, the way the place was. It needed redoing.
Was Karen Pedley being safety conscious, or was she laying the groundwork to return to her old tricks?
Greg, who was one of the owners, he used to do all the fire drills and the things like this. And she was always pestering him for more training and talking about fires, and she seemed to be wanting to know lots about the fire and where things were, and always wanted more fire exercises done and more information on fire training. And but he thought she was just interested, so actually told him how she'd rescued somebody, and this was down at the Seafarers at Falmouth, how she'd worked there and she'd rescued somebody from the home when it caught on fire.
In fact, while Karen was working at the Seafarers Hostel, fires had broken out in 3 of the elderly residents' rooms. In what appeared a fortuitous coincidence, Karen had been on hand to help rescue the vulnerable gentleman who lived there. Later, it would become clear she had started the fires. She needed to be seen as the hero.
It's whenever she feels particularly suppressed psychologically, when her self-esteem is particularly low, I think she's going to go back to what she knows. And for Karen Pedley, that's starting a fire. And what followed, what she assumes will always follow, is the esteem, is the approval, is the sense of mattering that I think is so missing in Karen's life.
2008 was the year that Karen Pedley took her risky game to the next level. On one chilly night in late November, things were peaceful at Roseman House.
Well, it had been a sort of normal day as far as I can remember. I'd been out in the evening and I'd come back into the home and my mother was there. So I went in every night and made sure she was in bed and she was okay.
On the 23rd of November, Miss Spargo went home. On her way out, she noticed that Karen was actually in one of the rooms with one of the residents and seemed to be having lots of fun dancing with them.
Those residents were 96-year-old Gladys Rowe and her roommate Olive Ray. Karen was with them in room 5, along with a co-worker called Catherine.
I'd seen Karen was with Catherine, putting Joan and Gladys to bed. They had music on and they were singing and laughing and playing around.
Jenny walked to her house just a few yards away on the same site as the nursing home.
I'd then gone over and got ready for bed, And within about 20-25 minutes, I had a phone call to say, can you come over here, there's a room on fire.
When Jennifer Spargo arrived at the nursing home, there was a scene of chaos. The elderly residents were being evacuated from their rooms. Now, she went straight up to room 5. There was smoke billowing out from there, and she just couldn't get in.
I tried to open the door, and I couldn't because the room was just black. And I would say in 48 years of care, it was the worst thing I've ever done. And it was just horrible. It was just a horrible, horrible night. So I just opened it slightly, and it was completely black. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see a thing.
The fire had begun in room 5, the room of Gladys Rowe and Olive Ray, the room that Karen Pedley had been seen in by colleagues minutes before.
On the night of the fire in Rosewyn House, it was a point of comment that Karen Pedley seemed quite excitable, quite happy. She was jumping around and dancing with the residents, which wasn't her usual behaviour. But it kind of indicates that she was looking forward to something, thinking about it, and it was exciting her.
That something was her latest arson attack.
What Karen Pedley did here was to light a fire in the bedroom of somebody who was almost certainly, even if they were in good physical shape, not going to be able to escape because they were asleep at the time. By the time they woke, the fire could almost certainly have engulfed the room. Not only did she do that, but she actually chose to do so in the room of very, very vulnerable older people who were not going to be fit to run away. Arsonists, in my opinion, all show a deep lack of compassion, but this is taking it to another level.
The fire service were called. This was a big fire. This was a serious fire. And it didn't take the fire service very long to work out where the seat of that fire was. And they found that fire had been started in room 5.
Jenny Spargo was immediately suspicious about how the fire had started. Fire doors in the home were designed to close to stop fire spreading, but the one in room 5 had not closed.
The trouble is, because you've been so meticulous with what you do and with training and the fire regulations, you keep thinking there's got to be something more to this.
Could a careless smoker, one of the residents perhaps, have caused the fire?
Nobody smoked in their bedrooms. We had a smoking area because elderly people, I'm afraid, do smoke. In fact, some of them were very hairy smokers, but we only had a couple that smoked.
As Jenny struggled to solve the mystery, there was tragic news from the hospital. 5 days after the blaze, one of the women evacuated from room 5 died. 96-year-old Gladys Rowe.
Well, Gladys had been with us for 9 years. She was quite a character, you know. She was just a well-known person in Truro. And a lot of my grandchildren used to come up and they always used to go and talk to Gladys because Gladys would tell them tales about what happened years ago, which was, really quite interesting. They loved it.
Gladys was still alive when she was rescued from room 5, but the damage to her lungs had been done. A small community was in shock. Then, to heap tragedy upon tragedy, Gladys's roommate Olive Ray died. Investigators did everything they could, but the cause of the fire remained a mystery.
From the very beginning, when it was found by the fire service that this was a suspicious fire, Karen Pedley tried to deflect the blame. Not just away from herself, but on to another specific person.
We weren't allowed to go up there anymore. We weren't allowed to go in the room, and the dogs came up with the fire people to check for accelerants, and then they ripped up the floorboards and we had to wait, and they said they couldn't find anything at all whatsoever. So basically that night it was all speculation of what happened.
It seems that suspicion fell very, very quickly onto Karen. She was arrested but was released on bail, as this was going to be a real protracted inquiry.
Cases like this can be extremely difficult to investigate, especially if there's no forensic evidence and no independent witnesses.
Pedley was soon released. There was not enough evidence to lay a charge. And as time passed to Jenny Spargo and the Truro community, it looked as though the investigation had ground to a halt.
You keep thinking there's got to be something more to this. And we had to go to the police and give statements and whatever. And then it all went quiet until I think it was 2 or 3 years later that they actually had the inquest.
This arson was quite difficult to prove for the police, but you know, they were working in the background.
But there would be no immediate breakthrough, so Karen's trail of death and destruction were far from over.
Pedley is clearly and utterly obsessed with starting fires. There are very few more dangerous types of people.
And her next targets would be her own family.
But like, my Auntie Karen was making jokes and everything, which wasn't the right moment to do anything like that.
No one linked the incidents of fire which Karen Pedley had caused throughout her life. As a 10-year-old, she'd been linked with a fire at her family home. As she became a young woman, she took jobs where fires would soon begin. After marriage, she'd set alight her sister's home, and in 2010, she struck again.
So a couple of years after the fire at the care home, Karen's sister experienced a fire that broke out under the stairs in her house.
Karen's sister, Jenny Stringer, lived with her children in a town called Hale in Cornwall, some 14 miles from Karen's home. Karen's nephew Junior remembers it well. He has good reason to.
On the day of the fire, I got up like normal, went to school, and the bell rang for school to finish, and it just felt normal, like we were waiting for our mum, and then we just got kept in the office, and then I think it was like an hour later my mum turned up and said that the house had been on fire. And by the time we got back to the house, we had 3 fire engines and everything there, and they were still in the building at the time.
As the family began to process what had happened, an odd detail emerged. After Jenny had called the fire brigade, she called Karen.
She told me she was at home anyway. And literally within 5 minutes she was at my house.
And it was like, my auntie lives like half an hour away, and she was there within 5 minutes, which we felt really strange.
It was certainly strange, and if detectives had known of her past, suspicion would very quickly have fallen on Karen Pedley.
Because arson is one step removed, that it can be very difficult to pick up arsonists, and that what detectives will regularly do is to look for somebody who was first on the scene, who was suspiciously helpful, who wants to insert themselves into any investigation. That certainly, in retrospect, appears to be the situation with Karen Pedley.
As the family considered what to do next, Karen appeared strangely elated.
My Auntie Karen was making jokes and everything. Like, there was a bag of crisps on the floor, and she went, "Does anyone want any smoky bacon crisps?" Which wasn't the right moment to do anything like that. I was crying my eyes out. I got told we weren't allowed to go in the building. But I went, no, it's my house at the end of the day.
It was Karen who was there to pick up the pieces after this fire and to offer her sister and her sister's children help in getting them somewhere to stay.
So we stayed at my Auntie Karen's in Carharrick for, I think it was like 3 months.
It's like a compulsion with her. She's got to do it. It's just filling her mind most of the time. And Karen, very generously allows her sister to come and live with her, and again becomes a little bit of a hero in the situation.
This is remarkably similar, where she becomes then the hero after a fire. We can trace this right back to 1983.
By 2010, on at least 7 occasions when there had been an unexplained fire, Karen Pedley had been on hand to save the day or had recently been in the building. The fatal fire at Roseman House did not stop her.
Even after this blaze, where Karen Pedley is a suspect and she knows she's a suspect, she's not in custody. There's no evidence against her at this stage, but she doesn't stop setting fires.
It was now that Karen's close family witnessed her playing the knight in shining armour.
The pattern seemed to be, and wherever Karen Pedley was, there was a fire. And not only was she there, she was always the one who would call the police. She would be there at the scene, watching the catastrophe of her work, probably reliving some of that glory that she felt that time when she was 10 years old, when she became a hero and she got all of that attention.
Given the lack, I think, of any other meaningful emotional life, I think the moment the incident happened and all the approval and the media attention that followed happened, I think it was very likely that Karen Pedley was going to, whenever things went wrong when she's older, try and reenact this situation.
For 8 years, from 2002 to 2010, no one suspected Karen Pedley, who continued to act like a supportive, caring auntie.
That's the kind of person she was. Like, she would do anything for her family, and she wouldn't let us down.
Later that year, firefighters attended a house blaze in the village of Carharrick, just 2 minutes from where Karen Pedley lived. It was the 8th fire that would eventually be linked to Pedley. She'd already caused one death, and it seemed nothing would stop her before she struck again.
Karen Pedley clearly had no empathy for other people. She had no feeling for anybody except herself. This is a woman who had children and who, despite that, was prepared to set fires which are always going to carry a risk of her being convicted. She had no thought for the impact that her conviction and notoriety might have on her own family.
To bring Karen Pedley to justice, something had to happen for detectives to build a case. Jenny Spargo had never been satisfied that the blaze at Roseman House had been an accident. For 2 years, she, her boss Greg, and their colleagues had been asking questions and forming theories.
I suppose, to be honest, my suspicions were Karen. One of my staff had a friend who worked in another home, and apparently she'd worked there and there'd been a fire there as well. And I think this is what sort of put us, thinking, no, there's more to this. And then we put together that she'd mentioned about the seafarers as well, so that was another problem. So we just had to go with our gut instinct, I suppose.
Instinct told them that Karen Pedley had something to do with it, not least because the day after the fire, she had walked out of the care home and simply never returned. She failed to turn up for her next shift.
In the end, Greg actually spent 2.5 years pushing the police and pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's what he did basically for 2.5 years.
In 2012, detectives made a breakthrough. After a tip-off, they were granted a warrant to search Karen Pedley's home. What they found was eye-opening.
They searched her house and they found a scrapbook full of newspaper clippings from that incident back in 1983 when she supposedly saved her family.
For 3 decades, Karen had treasured the memory of 1983 when, for a few short weeks, she'd been a hero.
When everybody is applauding you, everyone's congratulating you, all eyes are upon you, you are not going to forget that moment.
It was through responding to the fire that Karen got a taste of approval and of even existing, of having any identity of her own. I think it's not surprising that when anybody tries to push her down, keep her down, when anything goes wrong in her life, she tries to recreate these conditions.
Had detectives found a motive for Karen Pedley to start fires, one of which had claimed a life? The discovery of the scrapbook kick-started the investigation once again.
Then further inquiries into her background, her places that she lived, and her places of work, they've started to find a pattern of fires happening wherever Karen Pedley happened to be. At this stage, alarm bells are going to start ringing. Fire seems to follow this girl around, and you'd really need to start thinking how and where and what else has happened in the past that we don't know about.
Investigators had now uncovered the pattern of suspicious blazes starting at places with links to Karen Pedley. But as she continued to set fires, could they prove it and stop her before there was another tragedy? And what part would her family play in her plan to avoid detection?
To be truthful, I didn't think it had anything to do with my auntie. And it was like, you read everything and it just comes out that she was the only one working on that day.
In 2013, Karen Pedley may have felt nervous. Police were investigating at least 12 suspicious fires across West Cornwall, and by then she was their #1 suspect for causing the death of an elderly lady at Rosewind Care Home.
There's clear evidence she made real efforts to cover her tracks and try and take suspicion away from herself.
Pedley felt she needed the family's help.
My mum had a phone call from the police to say that my Auntie Karen wants her to make a statement to say that my mum was with her when there was a care home fire. And my mum said no.
As detectives kept digging, they discovered that in the wake of one arson attack, Karen had forced a co-worker to back up her alibi.
From the very beginning, when it was found by the fire service that this was a suspicious fire, Karen Pedley tried to deflect the blame, not just away from herself, but on to another specific person. And she became very, very difficult to deal with over this, and she became threatening. She even threatened this other person that she was going to burn their house down, which seems a very strange thing to do when you have been perhaps put under suspicion of arson.
Originally, a co-worker didn't tell the truth to the police. But a short while later, her conscience got the better of her, and she finally told the truth. And that truth was that Karen Pedley had threatened her.
It was then that investigators learned that Pedley was often the first person to report the fires and would be present when firefighters arrived at the scene, offering her suggestions about how the blazes could have begun. The net began to close in, but building a case would be tough.
Now, this is a case investigating historic crimes like this, where you may not have any huge, great big bits of evidence. This is what we call similar fact evidence. We'll try and present the evidence that Karen Pedley, in a number of occasions, in almost identical situations, had set a fire or been close to where a fire was set, had been the one to call the police.
In February 2015, now living 400 miles away in Newcastle upon Tyne, Karen Pedley was arrested. Her nephew, Junior Stringer, couldn't believe the claims.
Didn't think it had anything to do with my auntie. And it was like, you read everything and it just comes out that she was the only one working on that day. And it was like the night when the fire happened, and you just try and think, well, no, it's got nothing to do with my family.
Charged with almost a dozen arsons dating back to 2002, the attempted murder of Olive Wren and the murder of Gladys Rowe, Karen Pedley was remanded in custody. Even in jail, her urge to start fires was too strong to ignore.
She sets fire to her own cell. I mean, this compulsion that she has, she doesn't seem to realise how it's constantly pointing the finger back at her, that she is actually guilty of all these fires.
When the case came to court, there seemed to be a significant amount of evidence against her. There seemed to be all the similar facts around all the number of fires that we believe total about 14. Obviously the worst of these was the one where, unfortunately, Gladys passed away as a direct result of that, and the jury convicted her.
It was a moment of truth for Karen Pedley's family.
She tried denying it all the way through her life. And it's like we found out that she'd done that many fires, and we just couldn't believe her anymore.
The realisation that it was Auntie Karen who'd taken everything from him as a child hit Junior even harder.
So when I found out that she set the fire in my home, I was really shocked. because she denied all the fires she'd done, but it was when she went to court and she admitted to the one that she'd done in my home. That was it. I had nothing more to do with the family. We didn't want anything to do with them.
A psychiatrist report found that Karen to be of low intelligence with a personality disorder. Junior Stringer wonders if her actions all go back to the event that had defined her childhood.
I have wondered why so many times, but to be truthful, I don't think I'll ever have an answer for why she wanted to do that. So I think she's had it where if she sets a fire and then she'll save everyone.
It seems to me that Karen Pedley wanted to be the hero of the day. We can trace that back to 1983, and it shows up again when she magically appears on scene when her sister's house is on fire. I think it made her feel good about herself.
In fact, at Pedley's trial there was speculation about the origins of that devastating blaze in Karen's childhood home. She had been thought a hero, but was she actually the villain of the piece?
To this day, we still don't know whether it was her, but hearing from the judge, he was the one who was saying that it could possibly be her, because that's where she's got it from, where if she saves someone, she'll get a reward, and she got the reward of going on the Concorde.
I think it's possible that she did set the fire, but I don't think at this stage that she was an arsonist. I think she may have, as many children do, simply have been playing with matches.
It wasn't the fire itself, but rather how her actions were received that fed Karen's pyromania as she grew.
When you have the complete deprivation of attention and the complete deprivation of any understanding of right and wrong, it produces what can almost be likened to an almost feral child. A child almost raised in the wild. Now, a feral child who will do almost anything to survive is an absolute blank page, is absolutely primed for any salient, any strong psychological episodes, any definitive episodes, such as what happened purely possibly by chance in Karen Pedley's life with the fire and her coming across a fire in her family home. On such a blank page, on such a psychologically empty landscape, this would have enormously impacted her.
Karen Pedley had become a woman made for murder, not through her desire to see people die, but by failing to connect fire with lethal danger.
I really don't think that she would have been deliberately using fire, particularly in the early days, to harm other human beings. I think it was a statement, an outburst, a reaction, rather than a premeditated attempt at murder in the early days.
Fire was her obsession. Indeed, sentencing Pedley, the judge expressed astonishment that she had continued to start fires even after the death of Gladys Rowe.
Karen Pedley felt compelled to keep setting fires. Gladys Rowe's death would not have ended that compulsion. To put it very, very bluntly, Gladys Rowe was collateral damage in her wider campaign of arson. I don't think she really probably cared that much, if at all, that somebody had died. It may have added to the drama.
I would view Karen Pedley as being a risk for the rest of her life. She uses fire as a weapon. I think she feels fire gives her an enormous sense of power.
Had Pedley's early years contributed to a state of mind where she simply didn't have a sense of right and wrong, where she didn't feel enough empathy to stop her committing harm?
I don't think she's ever mattered to anybody particularly. So when you have that kind of upbringing, then other people do not have the same significance that they do to you or I. And I think that's what we're seeing here, that although she had quite friendly relationships with the old people that she was caring for and knew them, and we know that she danced with them and played with them, ultimately her need for esteem, her need to matter, her need to feel this sense of significance again would override any other human emotions.
Karen Pedley was jailed for a minimum of 27 years for the murder of 96-year-old Gladys Rowe, who was fatally injured in the fire at Roseland House in November 2008. She was further given 14 life sentences for her numerous acts of arson. She was found not guilty of the attempted murder of Olive Ray. Karen Pedley, a child who became a hero, an employee who took out her grudges by setting ablaze those places where she had lost jobs, an aunt and sister who played the Good Samaritan after she herself had set another house on fire. She had become a woman who played with fire, and in the process was made for murder.
It was inevitable that at some stage her carelessness with human life would end in somebody being killed.
这不是景点区，这是奔景点区的路上。海鲜溜熟是什么意思呀？吃的。你这让我问多少钱吗？来海边上肯定得吃点海鲜啊，怎么多少也得吃点。
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you, but to get a red wine and take it with a